outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hello and good evening to you from TTR Towers. It is another lovely Monday evening conversation to talk about behaviour and exclusions. And I've got two fantastic guests who are warming up to tell us their views and thoughts and opinions on behaviour and exclusions in schools, I guess specifically in the UK. But it could be anywhere in the world, really, that we're talking about. We're talking about the concept. We're talking about the implementation. We're talking specifically as well about an article that was in the Observer last week, very controversial article, let's say, that got a lot of attention. We're going to maybe dig into that a little bit. And we're going to talk about some of the controversies around exclusions, some of the things that are said about exclusions, and sort of try and dissect that. I'm going to introduce my guests in a moment. Just before I do that, it would be remiss of me to not mention our sponsors on tonight's show, who are John Catt Educational. Now, if you haven't heard of John Catt, you should have. They're one of the leading publishers of professional development resources for teachers in the UK. They offer a huge range of books that you can buy to aid your professional development. And if you want to get 20% off any book on the John Catt website, you can do so by using the code JCTTR2425, which is on screen now at the bottom. And you can use that code and you can go there and you can put as many books as you want in your basket and you can make a purchase and save 20% on those books. Thank you very much, John Catt, for supporting the show. I will mention them again later. Long-time partners and friends of Teachers Talk Radio. Andrew, good evening to you. How are you?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on here. Now, I will let you, Andrew, introduce yourself to begin with.
Oh, I'm just a teacher and blogger.
Yep. Now, Andrew, you have been writing blogs, I think I read the other day, for 20 years.
18.
18. So that's when I started my teaching career, that you just started blogging. That's impressive. How many blogs have you written?
I've never tried to count, but it's probably averaging one a week for that time, I guess. So.
You're talking hundred. You're talking potentially 1,000 blogs or something. Talking a lot of blogs. Now, you more recently, I say more recently, maybe in the last, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, in the last sort of year or two, have written probably more about behaviour and exclusions than you've done in the past. Would that be fair, or do you think you've always have?
It probably well, I wrote a lot about behaviour all along, but the issue of exclusions, it's probably the last 5 or 6 years. And that was just mainly, it became a bit of an issue. Perhaps it was even earlier than that. But in the late 2010s, there was a lot of discussion of exclusions. And I started looking into the data and checking were the claims being made true. Yeah,
because it's fair to say that some of the things you tweet, they certainly get a reaction, particularly when it comes to exclusions and some of the statistics that you post around exclusions and some of the things that are said there. So it'll be interesting to delve into some of that this evening. Now, it would be remiss of me to not mention, Andrew, if you have any thoughts from the outset on some of the stuff that's happened over the weekend with regards to the big news story, if you like, that ResearchEd cancelled their ResearchEd Israel after uproar online. I wondered whether you had any thoughts on that just before we get into this stuff.
I tend to think they did the right thing just because in the kind of Twitter environment, well, X environment, any organisation that had a conference in Israel was going to get protested and intimidated and bullied. And ResearchEd is just teachers. It's just volunteers. and you can't really put volunteers under that kind of pressure. So in a way, I think it's a shame that they had to give in, but I think it was inevitable that they did. But I wasn't terribly happy to have things see it that politicized. I don't think the average. I don't think teachers in Israel. Sorry, I don't think teachers in Israel, coming to meet about teaching, are personally culpable for war in the Middle East, and I don't think they should be ostracized either.
I've seen a lot of people say, though, to you and to other people on this point, that the whole of education is political. I've seen people respond to what you've said there and literally said all of education is political. And they have said things like research ed is political, and, the people who run research ed are political. And it's clear where the politics lie. I mean, what would you say to that?
I mean, I'm always worried when people say everything's political, because there wouldn't be a need for everything was political. Most people that make these claims that everything's politicized, and that if you look at, if they're saying it on social media, you look at their past posts and they've used political in the normal sense in the past and implied that some things aren't political. Everyone's probably got their own personal political views, but as a teacher in the classroom, you're meant to put them aside. I mean, you're legally obliged to be putting them aside. That isn't your job. And I don't begrudge any teacher, telling people how to vote. I'm a member of a political party. I deliver a few leaflets now and again, but it's being a teacher is a completely different responsibility, and trying to politicize teaching, I don't agree with. Often that just comes down to indoctrination. And when you see how people react to the idea of people being taught, people teaching in classrooms the ideas they don't like, that they can see it too when it's convenient. It's just they want teachers to default to their opinions. I also think that sometimes political ideas run against academic priorities. I mean, you're a history teacher. I mean, you must have heard versions of history that are, 99% politics and 1% actual history.
No, the US election's coming up, so I hear it every week at the moment. But yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I didn't want to spend too long on this, but I thought it would be remiss to not mention it, because it has been such a big thing over the last few days, and I thought it would be remiss to not say that. A few people have said they're sort of saying that they're checking out from research ed now. Do you understand that they're not going to speak, they're not going to attend? Do you understand that point of view, or are you saying you disagree with them on that?
I don't particularly understand it, given that the conference isn't going ahead.
But they were talking about all future research ads. They were saying future.
If you're boycotting an organisation because people don't share your political views, but are not expressing them, then I think you're just cutting yourself off from civil society. I mean, you need, if you're going to be a teacher, you should be able to work with people with different political views. And I've seen a lot of people saying you must express this opinion now or you're a baddie, and it's juvenile. Particularly if people are going to get angry, even just going over the facts of things. I think that's probably what winds me up most. I don't spend my time. I mean, I spend my time online discussing education, not so much politics. I usually get drawn into political stuff because even if I don't sympathise with a particular political idea, I notice that incorrect information is being shared. And, if the idea that you have to go along with false statements or contentious statements or controversial statements just to prove you're on the right side of history, I think that has a chilling effect on debate, but it's also just an unreasonable demand. There is a reason why people in England don't spend all their time talking about the Middle East. And sometimes it's they don't feel they know enough. Sometimes they feel they just don't want to argue over it. And those people that are obsessed with it and find, one of the most complicated conflicts in the world to be an easy thing to describe with one set of goodies and one set of baddies are not people that should be holding everyone else to account.
Listen, Andrew, thanks very much. We could probably talk a lot more about that, but the focus of tonight's show is obviously going to be around behaviour and exclusion. So let's kick this off, because I know you mentioned that you had been writing blogs for a long time. I wondered whether, because you mentioned the exclusions issue has come up in the last few years more. Why do you think that is?
There was a bit of a rise from about 2013 to 2016. And obviously that started in the Gove years. And I think that was seen as, a stick to hit the Tories with. Not so much by teachers, but people outside of education, particularly as there was a lot of education reform going on, and people scrutinize it and look for things that are going wrong. And one of the suggestions was, well, there must be something going wrong with behaviour if there's more exclusions. I think that also ties in with some people are very anti-authority and see teachers as authority figures and want them to be, don't want kids to be doing what teachers say. It's weird because sometimes you get a whole host of other issues and you realise when you get engaged in it, people are actually thinking about other things, which is why it's another one where I do tend to start with, well, can we look at the facts and agree what the facts are and then go from there? Though, as a teacher, I can't help but have opinions about the issue. I've taught in schools that didn't exclude and it had serious consequences.
Well, that was going to be my next question, was is there a personal story behind your sort of interest in behaviour and exclusions?
Well, behaviour, I think every teacher is interested in, unless you're extremely lucky to have never encountered the worst of it. But yeah, my supervillain origin story on this is when I started teaching as an NQT. So back in 2001, within that, the first school I worked at, within that first couple of years, a senior figure from the local authority came in and announced to the school that there would be no permanent exclusions in the city anymore. And some of the shocking behaviour, I mean, there was a virtual race riot at one point, but you could see that the removal of permanent exclusions as a sanction seemed to have a real impact, and it seemed to push everything else along. Like if the most serious violence was only going to be a suspension, then you couldn't use suspension for just verbal abuse. That could just be a detention, and things less serious, perhaps just a telling off or 5 minutes behind at the end of the lesson kind of thing. It just lowered the bar across the board. And it was, an outrageous thing, because there was pressure on teachers not to talk about behaviour, and certainly not to talk about the most serious incidents that were going on. And I mean, within the noughties, that did become an election issue in about 2005. And there was a report issued at the time, the Steer report on behaviour. And it was very much, a way to kick the issue into the, out of the headlines, and I'll refer to that review. And although it said some sensible things and said behaviour was important, it really did deny that there was a huge problem. In my years since, I've seen nothing like what I experienced in the noughties and early 2010s. And I don't want things to go back there. And I do think there's, a lot of talk about turning the clock back to those days.
So, I mean, the exclusions data, and again, you know more on this than I do, and we'll delve into it. but there were record permanent exclusions in 22-23. And, you know, no.
Nope.
I'm actually quoting here the much maligned Observer article because I wanted to see if you were going to pick me up on it. But this was the statement in that Observer article. Government data released this summer showed there were a record 9,400 permanent exclusions in 2022-2023, up 45% from 6,500 in 21-22.
To defend the Observer, which I'm reluctant to do, the DfE did print a claim that it was a record number of permanent exclusions on their website. So it's understandable why a lot of media sources believe that. However, they only published the data since 2006 to 7. And so it is the highest since then. But if you go back, and it's always only a few links away, you can get back into the 90s, and it was above 12,000 then. There was it was a lot higher at the turn of the century, and if you look at percentage rates, it's not the lowest, it's not the highest rate even in that 2006 to 2023 period. It was higher than that as a percentage in 2006 to 2007. Also, the Observer bizarrely has got the percentage rise wrong. It was 44%. I know it doesn't make much difference, but if they got their other figure from the DfE site, they should have seen that it was 44%.
Well, the exclusions are going up.
They've got yeah, well, we don't know because we're only up to 2023 in the figures, but that there has been a rise for the last 2 years, but that is a rise since the absolute lowest point in the pandemic, which is the lowest point. It was a record-breaking low, and it's risen since that record-breaking low.
Yeah, so it's risen. It's risen since the pandemic. Are we happy with that statement?
Yeah. First year, 2019 to 20, first year of the pandemic was the lowest it's ever been. Actually, it wasn't. It was the second year of the pandemic that was the lowest it ever was, 2020 to 21. And then the 2 years since, it's shot up.
Yeah.
And it is now higher than it's been for a long time. But even that, there's a bit of it's not hugely above where it used to be. It's 0.11%, and before the pandemic, it was 0.10%. So it's that little bit higher, and that makes it higher than it's been in a long time. But it's it's not unprecedented, and it is the rise is from a low point.
I don't want to. I'm interested to ask you a question now, which I think. I want you to answer however you feel that you want to answer it. Do you want this sounds like an obvious question. Do you want the exclusion numbers to come down?
I think my position is I don't mind them coming down as long as it's because behaviour has improved. My issue is pressure to force them down. Will just cause schools to ignore bad behaviour. It's not easy to improve behaviour, and if you just focus on the figures, then you don't actually improve behaviour. You just you just limit schools' ability to do anything about it.
Yeah. Okay, because there is a huge movement to reduce exclusions and to eliminate exclusions in many cases, actually. And I'm sorry, but I can't actually. I'll try to pronounce your name. I think it's Ute Steenkamp. Ute says it's not about behaviour; it's about needs not being met. Is what Ute comes. We can come back to this in a minute, Andrew. You fire these questions into you and these comments into you. JBL has said what we need to know is how many of those exclusions include incidents of serious violence. Now, Just, I don't know whether you want to comment on that first, Andrew. We will come back to it later.
I mean, two of them exclusions can have more than one reason given for them, but two of the most common reasons are assault against an adult and assault against a child, or assault against another pupil. So because of the overlap, you can't actually tell what proportion are for assault, but the best guess is it's probably more than a quarter of exclusions. And that, there's other forms of violence, and the top reason is persistent disruptive behaviour, which doesn't sound as serious, particularly if people focus on disruption rather than persistence. But the next few reasons for exclusions, they're all pretty serious: insult and verbal abuse and intimidation. There's drugs and alcohol, vandalism. And then if you get down to the rarer ones, things even more serious.
But there's many who would look at that and say, that's because the schools, the adults, the system isn't supporting those children to be able to regulate and manage their emotions and their behavior in a way that works for them, and therefore their needs are not being met in that respect. And even though I'm paraphrasing what someone would say now, by the way, this isn't what I would say, but they would say, even though we never excuse violence, we do need to do X, Y, Z because, and to quote the Observer article again, where they said children with special educational needs and disabilities, those on free school meals, and Black Caribbean children are among those who are significantly more likely to be permanently excluded. Have you got any thoughts on all of that?
Right. Well, I mean, there's quite a lot in that.
There is a lot in that. I want you to dissect it.
Bring me back to the statistics if I forget them. I mean, I think the first issue is the idea that we can deal with the problem by meeting needs. That's a very vague slogan. Nobody's against meeting needs. If you have interventions that will improve behaviour, no school is saying, oh, no, we don't want those. We'd rather just exclude. The issue is...
Well, that's what people are saying, though. That's what people are saying is happening.
That schools are saying, oh, we don't want your successful evidence-based intervention that will improve behaviour.
Well, no, people are saying that schools are being very sort of quick on the draw when it comes to suspensions and exclusions.
There've been surveys of teachers, and teachers say the exact opposite. Very few teachers think schools are quick to exclude. It's always people outside of schools that are claiming this. And I mean, suspensions is more difficult, but permanent exclusions, 0.11% is not, which the supposed record-breaking high is not that high compared with the number of assaults and even serious crimes that happen in schools. But I think the key thing is schools don't want bad behaviour. If you have an intervention to give to a school that will stop severe bad behaviour, there's no school saying, oh, no, we prefer exclusion. Exclusions are a lot of hassle. The trouble is people that believe they can fix bad behaviour are usually pushing some very ideological idea that has no evidence behind it. And there are very few interventions that have been shown for the most severe behaviour that have been shown to work at all. And even then, we say it works if it improves the situation, not that it prevents all the bad behaviour. And when people start talking like, a huge proportion of the most severe behaviour could just be gotten rid of by talking about trauma or asking students how they feel or just loving them a bit more, it might make them feel good, but it's not going to actually work. And you don't do kids any favours by pretending that you can fix them, that you can change their behaviour just by being a nicer teacher. Everyone wants the worst behaved kids to improve their behaviour. No one wants anyone to have to depart from the school, but there is no quick fix. And there's the bigger issue then of if there is that extreme behaviour and there is no easy way to fix it, how much danger do you put other children and school staff in the meantime? People have a habit of just focusing on the worst behaved pupils and ignoring their victims. And part of the reason why the push for never excluding that started in the noughties failed was because a school got sued by a teacher who was raped. And the entire case was based on the fact that that pupil had already sexually assaulted a member of staff and was not permanently excluded. And the teachers were not warned about this pupil being dangerous. And there has to be a line where you just say children are in danger, teachers are in danger if we tolerate behaviour beyond a particular limit. When people talk as if exclusions are bad, that's the question I want them to answer. What behaviour are you willing to tolerate? And you tend to find it's not even them that's having to tolerate it. They want teachers to tolerate it, and they would not put up with it for a moment if it was happening to them or if it was their children that were in the most disorderly classrooms. Good intentions don't solve this problem. I wish there was a simple solution. I wish we could just, take the children aside, have a restorative conversation, and no one ever gets hurt.
One of the things, though, that's, I guess, one part of the argument you've got there, but there's this other part as well about SEND and disabilities.
That's it. Like each one of those statistics
I
have to go into.
Yeah, well, it's not so much the statistics is one part of it, but I also wanted to ask you around taking SEND and disability is, many people would say that this isn't just about sort of being nicer to them, but more specialist care / intervention / support / funding, whatever guise you want to put on it, is that's why we've got a problem. That that it's not just what it's not what you're saying. It's actually that there isn't specialist support in there.
People like to make it about an issue of SEND, and again, it's so they can say, well, there's these interventions, we meet the needs, we solve the problem. But when you dig into it, although pupils with SEND are on average more likely to be permanently excluded, the vast majority of the permanently excluded pupils with SEND have been classed as SEMH, social, emotional and mental health needs. And the vast majority have been classed as SEND when they're at the age of 12 and above for the first time, which is literally the age where behaviour becomes an issue. And, we know in schools that SEMH is the category we'd use for someone who needed support with their behaviour. So we end up recognising the bad behaviour, and I think correctly saying that, the first thing you want to do with a child whose behaviour is out of control is find a way to support them. But then it goes back the other way and say it's treated like, well, they have a disability, so you can't blame them for their behaviour. Well, you still have to do something about their behaviour, and calling it a disability doesn't solve the problem. In fact, I think behaviour interventions are often less effective when you're looking for a root cause rather than looking for behaviour change. I think, the small minority of pupils who are excluded, their behaviour is often so extreme, there is never one single cause that can be addressed. And certainly there's no behaviour intervention based on looking for root causes that has ever been shown to work effectively. Some of the behaviour interventions based on that idea have been shown to make behaviour worse. I think a lot of teachers have experienced that, of everyone wanting to intervene with a child whose behaviour is bad because we know they have issues and problems and home problems, and none of it makes a difference.
Just a comment here from London Governance. There should also be a SEN report at PEX level, as this is usually the tipping point in an IRP. Just to say to everyone out there, if you want to comment or pose a question or anything, we've got David Urwin, who's going to be coming on in a bit as well. So if you've got any questions or comments to any of our guests tonight, obviously feel free to tweet us at TT Radio Official, or you can, even if you're watching this back and you've got something to say, then get in touch. Send us an email, info@ttradio.org. I'm sure there will be many more conversations on these topics. But Andrew, I'm not sure exactly what London governance means there, but I know what the phraseology means.
I'm going to guess they think there's some kind of assessment you do when you suspect a child has generic SEN, and you do the test and it comes back and says, oh, you have generic SEN. We'll address this. But the trouble is, SEN is a very broad term. As I say, when it comes to behaviour, at least in secondary school, it's mainly SEMH, which again is a very broad term. There's not an obvious way to check, are you of sound mind? Are you social? Are you socially? Do you have social and emotional problems? Well, perhaps if you're, the most extremely badly behaved kid in the school, you do have social and emotional problems. But we know that from the behaviour, and we don't know how to address that.
But are you saying though that let's imagine whether it's a formal diagnosis or whether it's a school-based concern that's been raised about, and whether we call it SEND or SEMH or whatever, are you saying that only clinical diagnosis should be accounted for in any discussions over exclusions?
I think it should be evidence-based. And
so that would have to be a clinical diagnosis. Well, unless are you saying that an in-school interventions that have gone on over a period of time and then led to them being placed on, say, a register in school for SEMH, are you saying that's evidence-based enough for you?
I think behaviour interventions need evidence that they work and don't make things worse. Just because there is a body of research out there showing that a lot of behaviour interventions make behaviour worse. That doesn't mean... It doesn't necessarily mean you need a medical diagnosis, because, just because someone is extremely badly behaved doesn't mean they have a medical condition. But if you're trying to say, oh, they have some other need that must be addressed, you get into a lot of real pseudoscience there. There's a lot of beliefs that every risk factor for poor behaviour is the cause of poor behaviour, and we can somehow address the cause. And yet, we do not have evidence-based methods for doing that, because often the explanations are simply not that simple. Any potential cause of exclusions that you can find, you'll find that the vast majority of children with that problem are nowhere near the level of exclusion. The best predictor of whether a pupil is going to be permanently excluded is their past behaviour, whether they've been suspended in the past or not. There is no need you can identify that will be a good predictor that they're going to end up being permanently excluded.
Listen, Andrew, we've got a few questions coming in, which I'll read out to you in comments as well. Just before we do that, big shout out to John Catt, our sponsors tonight. If you have not heard of John Catt, get over to johncattbookshop.com, would you? Because, if you want anything on behaviour, exclusions, SEND, anything, any topic you can think of in education, they are the publisher for you. Get over there. You've got a 20% discount. You can use the code JCTTR2425. That's JCTTR2425. And you can get 20% off any John Catt book. Now, Andrew, I want to read out. We always read out all comments here. So we've got a comment from Charlotte. I'm really shocked by the ignorance of this conversation, the lack of understanding of basic child development or awareness that it's a good idea to check and remediate basic development for all children and to proactively support good development. I mean, I'm just asking questions, Charlotte, but I appreciate you getting in touch and sending us your comment. We appreciate all comments. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think we have to remember that children are most likely to be excluded at secondary school, and that they're a tiny minority. So when you start saying it's child development issues, or that there are straightforward checks that will then lead into behaviour. And how do you support good development? I mean, this kind of phrase, it doesn't actually explain the situation of somebody who is the tallest boy in their year group. They're now 14 and they've started to realise teachers are intimidated at them. Is that a developmental problem? The scientific language winds me up, not because there is no science of behaviour, but because it's used to highlight where the science actually is, which is very few limited options. And if you have an intervention that has a positive effect on behaviour, great. But anyone that pretends that you can just stop, cut off, upstream all the factors that might result in a child being extremely badly behaved in their teenage years, it's a myth. And, I'd love to see the evidence. I'd love it for it to be true. But you get people that offer these things and they do not work. And very often, you just have to look up their idea on Wikipedia and you'll see somebody's looked up and said, "Oh, there's no evidence for this." That's the thing that always gets me. If the only level of research we had was let's look this up on Wikipedia before saying it will stop all exclusions and solve all behaviour problems, we'd be more realistic than most of the debates we have now.
Another comment here from Paul Giles, who says, what are your thoughts on MATs who operate a non-permanent exclusion policy, particularly when the lead school is in a leafy suburb and others are in areas of high deprivation with generational lack of carer support?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think what made me what I am on this issue is the experience of working in a school that was told it couldn't permanently exclude. You end up with a situation of either just tolerating the worst behaviour or perhaps getting rid of kids in ways that are unethical. I wish there was a simple solution, but a non-permanent exclusion policy usually tends to be a cover things up policy or a do things off the books, exclude in ways that might be slightly dodgy policy.
Charlotte's followed up in what you said by saying we have a lot of evidence about how humans develop. We choose to ignore and not check. Poor development is going to make a person hyper alert, more likely to struggle to behave calmly.
Well, I wish it was true that there was some, we could just check up on someone's development and say, oh, if we do this, then in 5 years' time, when they're 14, they won't, headbutt a teacher. But there is no such test. This isn't science. I bet Charlotte Davies doesn't work in a school. I bet she sells interventions of some kind. Please tell us who you are, Charlotte.
Well, we don't know. We don't know what Charlotte does, so I can't comment on that. She has said that she's giving up on the conversation. It's a Trump-Johnson level chat, and it's not possible to share documents or screenshots. Well, listen, Charlotte.
She can't even tell us what she does for a living because
there is a
Charlotte Davies I've encountered on Twitter who thinks behaviour problems are caused by things in the ear. Is that the Charlotte Davies? Come on, tell us. Tell us.
I don't know, but I thank you for tuning in, Charlotte, and thank you for sharing your views as always, because we like all views here on TTR. They're all welcome. So thank you very much. Okay, moving on, Andrew, the other issue that has been one of your bugbears, shall we call it, has been a line that was actually removed from that article by The Observer after it was community noted on X, which featured a line that said, I think, because the line's been deleted, so you'll have to tell me what it said. But I think it said that black children are significantly more likely to be permanently excluded.
Yes,
and you dispute that, don't? Now, I have to tell you, Andrew, that I was chatting to a member of the TTR family, one of my fellow hosts, who and we had a little debate on this as well. So I'd like to read out what they said on it, because I'm sure their view actually would be shared by many, actually. in fairness. So I want to bring in what they said on it, and then hopefully you can have. But do you want to before I get that comment? Do you want to tell me what you thought of that line and why you decided to challenge it?
The permanent exclusion rate for black pupils is 0.09%. And we know that the average exclusion rate for all pupils is 0.11%. And the exclusion rate for white British pupils is, I believe, 0.13%. So, statistically, it's simply not true. It used to be the case. I mean, it has only changed since 2019. But even if you go back to when the exclusion rate for black pupils was much, much higher, it followed a downward trajectory pretty much consistently for 20 years. And we've now reached the point where black pupils are noticeably less likelier to be excluded than white British pupils. And people tend not to check these statistics when they've heard them so many times. So I think the most common cause of this mistake is probably just being out of date. There are other possibilities. In particular, I think when people haven't worked in diverse areas, they're a bit fuzzy on what some of the language means. So they tend to think Black Caribbean and Black African all mean the same thing, and they must all be the same statistics, rather than, these are distinct groups and they have different risks of permanent exclusion.
Well, the group that's been founded, called the School Inclusion Project, which is a group of over 200 lawyers who have come together to fight cases of unlawful exclusion, they've said that it's really common, quote, for lawyers to be called in to help Black Caribbean boys with SEND, often with no official diagnosis, who have been excluded. Quote, behaviour that arises from unmet additional needs is often profiled by schools as black boys being more violent. Any thoughts on that section of the article? And also the campaign group that has been set up? Because obviously there must be, if over 200 lawyers are getting involved, there must be something going on here.
Well, I mean, it's impressive to have over 200 lawyers looking into permanent exclusions of Black Caribbean pupils, given that only 145 in this record-breaking year were permanently excluded. And not all of those are boys. And are we meant to believe they all have undiagnosed SEND? So we have more lawyers than we have excluded Black Caribbean pupils by quite a way, and certainly more lawyers than Black Caribbean boys being permanently excluded. Black Caribbean pupils do have a higher rate of exclusion, although the gap between them and white British pupils has lowered pretty consistently over time as well. But Black Caribbean, there aren't actually that many Black Caribbean pupils. They're about a sixth of the black pupils in schools. They're less than 1% of the school population.
So why then are these lawyers doing this then? Why are they saying and doing this?
It's a good question. I mean, I've tended to put it down to perhaps firstly, just political activism. Let's make everything, I talked about people looking for excuses and being anti-teacher authority. One thing to go for is just say, oh, teachers are racist, and then pour over the statistics, even if overall it shows white British pupils are much more likely to be permanently excluded than ethnic minority pupils. So I think it's just it's a convenient focus for activism. That's not to say if you think there is a problem with the relatively small number of Black Caribbean pupils who are permanently excluded, we can look into it. I mean, there's so few of them that you could literally speak to every single school head teacher of every single school that has ever excluded, has excluded a permanently excluded Black Caribbean pupil within a year. A given
Chris
year.
Has asked, yeah, go on. Sorry, Andrew. There's a question from Chris.
Yeah.
Are there racial differences in the stats for SEND pupils permanently excluded?
I'm not aware of any difference, but I must admit, I have, while I've put in an FOI for gender and free school meals differences between racial groups, I haven't done it for SEM pupils. But I think it's unlikely, given that we know what drives SEN in permanently excluded pupils anyway. It's it's SEMH at the at secondary school level. There's no obvious reason to think that will differ between ethnic groups.
Okay. So, I mean, let's go back into sort of. I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot, but you may have heard that phrase, "school to prison pipeline." I've certainly heard that phrase a lot, actually, in the last couple of years. I still see it from time to time. And there is a line of thinking that would say that zero tolerance policies, so-called zero tolerance policies, are causing or contributing to this school to prison pipeline, and that this could be avoidable with alternative approaches to education and to behaviour sort of policies, whether that be exclusion or suspension or other things. What's your view on that?
I mean, it's one of those things where if we could identify which schools were zero tolerance, we might get some kind of coherent argument out of it. If we could actually find a link between permanent exclusion and going to prison that wasn't better explained by other factors, we might have some kind of argument. Unfortunately, we just seem to, people want to blame schools for criminals, and they don't tend to build a particularly convincing case and fill in the gaps. I mean, I've tried to go through virtually every version of this argument to make sense of it, but there is no strong one. One of the things that most sticks in my mind is that I don't think people realise how difficult it is for a young person to end up in custody. The last time I looked up the figures, there are, if you look at under 18s, I think about 400 young people in custody. You can't do the current population, but if you go back to previous youth custody populations, it's less than a quarter have ever been permanently excluded. And some of those will have been permanently excluded after they started offending.
But that phrase must have come from somewhere, though.
School to prison pipeline. It comes from, we know where it comes from. It comes from the US. It comes from the idea that if you have police officers in schools, then it will result in more pupils going to prison. And if you kick out students that bring in guns or drugs, they're more likely to end up in prison. Now, I'm not sure it's a slam dunk case for America, but there's a lot more young people locked up in America. And when they talk about zero tolerance, they aren't talking about, it's usually a very different idea of zero tolerance to what people that expect from British schools when they apply the term. Some people refer to America brain, where people look at an argument or a debate in America and just try and apply it to this country. And, it doesn't tend to work terribly well. We have a lot less crime. Fortunately, we don't have much in the way of school shootings. And we don't tend to spend our time debating race all the time. We've got the fundamental difference that neither our exclusion figures nor our academic results or our academic progression to higher education in this country are biased against Black pupils. That should be a success story, but instead people would rather believe, everywhere in the world is like America, and we should just regurgitate slogans from America.
I'm going to bring David on now, hopefully. Here's David. Hello, David. Good evening to you.
Hiya.
Now, you've been watching our conversation so far between Trump and Johnson. don't know which one's which, apparently. But yeah, it's been interesting, and obviously you work in an AP, and I know we always argue on X. Usually I get frustrated because you just will not concede a point. A little bit like Andrew, but on the other side of the fence, because yeah. But David, you have certain views on this, right? I'm sure. Yeah. Now, I want to explore those. Just before we do that, actually, Andrew, there's been a question again for you. Just before we move on to David, Ute has asked, can Andrew suggest any alternatives to suspensions or permanent exclusions?
Yeah, the alternative to suspensions and permanent exclusions, there's two main alternatives. One is tolerating really extreme bad behaviour, and the other one is getting rid of the children in unofficial ways. I do not recommend either of those alternatives, but we can expect both of them if schools are put under pressure to reduce suspensions or permanent exclusions.
Right, David, do you want to introduce yourself? Please stay, Andrew, if you can. We would love you to stick around. David, please introduce yourself if you can for everyone.
So, yeah, I'm David. I work at an on-site alternative provision within a mainstream setting. I previously worked in day 6 provision. So that's the provision students go to 6 days after permanent exclusion. I've also worked in a large mainstream secondary of over 2,000 students. So I've worked in a range of settings. And yeah, currently in on-site alternative provision, so as part of that mainstream setting.
Thank you. Right, David, what is your view? Well, let me ask you straight off the bat first. Should a student be excluded for physically assaulting a pregnant teacher?
I think that is appropriate to exclude in those circumstances. I think it jumps straight into something I think is important, is that difference between equality and equity, in that I think that every single case needs to be looked at individually. Now, in that black and white context, I can't think of a reason why a suspension or whatever would not be appropriate in those circumstances. I think we'll talk in more detail about permanent exclusion and how that work, how we look at and operate that. But as a starting gotcha question, I think it
wasn't necessarily gotcha. It was because it was asked, I think, in the Scottish Parliament, actually, I think last year, or in Scottish politics. I don't know if it was in Parliament. So I found the answers quite interesting to it, that various different people gave. I
think I can add to a bit of context there. So when I worked in day 6, so that's students who have already been permanently excluded, there is a lot of violence, or can be violence, in those settings. I've worked with pregnant colleagues, and students have struck and would count as assault, hit on the arm or whatever. And decisions have been made not to suspend in those circumstances, but that's been driven through conversations with that colleague, with that context, and the staff who work there and their belief in what they're doing. You don't work in alternative provision unless you're passionate about working in alternative provision. So there have been circumstances where, when you look at the surface level behaviour, pregnant staff member in a school assaulted by a pupil, where suspension has not happened, but that does come down to making sure that staff member is fully involved, and that was driven by them in that context.
Do you think that is the right approach for the member of staff to input in that way?
Yeah, I think that having staff input on situations is really, really important, because it's a staff workplace. I think, as Andrew alluded to before, that very extreme example of the rape in a school, that staff hadn't been informed, that staff hadn't been told that someone had been sexually assaulted previously, those kind of extreme issues, and ensuring that staff are engaged. And now we're moving way lower down the spectrum of behaviour, but making sure that the staff are comfortable and happy with the outcomes that have been put in place is really important, because otherwise you're creating a division between students and staff. You're creating divisions between staff and SLT, and having that input, I think, is really important. Again, that goes back to this idea that I don't think you can have a menu of sanctions where a student does this, this is the sanction that they get, because I think there are too many moving pieces. Even in the justice system, we've got mitigations, we've got different sentencing for the same crime, and there's so many different moving parts. It has to be handled on a case-by-case basis, and I think you have to have the input by affected staff and students as well.
A couple of comments, and we will always show all comments. Of course we will, unless there's abuse in them, obviously. But I won't class calling me and Andrew Trump and Johnson as abuse. I may disagree with it, but, you know.
I'm not particularly keen on that one.
No, I was keen on it, but it wasn't abuse. Linda has said, why does she have to be pregnant? Can we not think about everyone? Of course, Linda. The reason I came out with that question is because it was a question in Scottish Parliament last year. It was a specific question that was posed to several different people, and it made the headlines because certain politicians answered it in a particular way. So that hopefully answers your question on that one. Sir Scarecrow, I think this is to David, disappointed with the answer. The staff don't go into school to be abused, and schools should take a zero tolerance approach to any form of violence against them. If a child lays a hand on a teacher, that should be then done permanently. If a child hit me and my school didn't permanently exclude, I'd be going to the police.
I'd love to pick up on that one, if that's all right.
Oh, yeah, please do.
I think absolutely. I think firstly, yeah, if you've been assaulted and the school doesn't do, if it's not dealt with to a satisfactory level, going to the police, you've been assaulted 100%. I think that, you know, in the setting that I previously worked at, the PRU, there isn't the option of permanent exclusion. That doesn't exist. They've already been permanently excluded. That is something that, again, we've elected to work in that setting. So I think that's slightly different. And I think that again, it's bringing a bit of later conversation in. The reality of a student being permanently excluded is they go into alternative provision and then get cycled straight back out into a mainstream through the fair access panel. Now that funds for local authorities are so low, and now that there's tightening budgets on everything, that turnover rate is much faster. So a child will go into a PRU, into a day 6 provision, and come out very rapidly on a fair access panel back into another mainstream for that behaviour to be dealt with. And I think that there are certain contexts where violence against a staff member or assault against a staff member absolutely needs to be exclusion, permanent exclusion. I'm not a zero.
But by saying that, you're saying there's circumstances where it wouldn't be.
I think that can happen. So, for example, I think that students can go into complete meltdown and lash out in a corner of a room and strike a teacher as they're doing it unintentionally, but they are lashing out. I think there are other things which, you know, spitting counts as a spot assault. Now, spitting is disgusting, but it counts as assault. It would be listed as an assault in those lists of reasons on a PX, but we're at different levels and categories. And I think that having that teacher consultation is really important. And so Scarecrow, for sure, if he's consulted and talked about after receiving that, then, you know, that's a really important thing to understand. And I think make sure your values align with your schools as well. In that I work in a setting which is a trauma-informed setting that is focused on restorative practices. That is a choice I've made moving into that school. I know that, firstly, that school will deal with assault on staff very, very seriously and severely if needed. But also within my section of it, the on-site provision, if I'm barged into, pushed past, the context is really, really important.
Andrew, I don't know whether I can see a lot of like facial expressions coming from your direction. So I want to know.
To be fair, part of it I was looking up Charlotte Davies just to see, and it turns out
really stung.
She has expertise in the areas of motor skills, sound processing skills, using Tomatis sound therapy, visual skills, and how these skills interrelate through games, puzzles, and physical activities. Further, how trauma of all kinds can impact on skills development. So I guess when she comes and says we need to look into child development and that will stop our exclusions problem, she may have already had a solution and was just looking for a problem to fit it to. Personally, though, I'm not convinced that Tomatis sound therapy will stop, a 14-year-old squaring up and hitting a teacher.
Thank you for that, Andrew. With what David, with what you were saying, one of the things I wanted to pick up on there was when you, I guess, rightly said, staff elect. You use the term staff elect to work in an AP or a PRU, okay, as a reasoning as to say, well, the context is different because they've already been excluded, and therefore, the approach to that needs to be different. Now, there will be those out there who would say, why is it okay? Not okay. When is it ever okay? Whether it's an an alternative provision unit, PRU, high school, SEND provision school, anywhere, are we in danger of sort of getting into a position where, well, because it's in a PRU, assault's okay because there's nowhere else for them to go. But once they're 18, they'll be on the street. So there won't be all these different options. It'll literally be, is assault okay? That'll be the question that's going to be asked then, isn't it? Playing devil's advocate there.
Totally. I think, it is important to stress assault is never okay. Being struck is never okay. I said it on Twitter a few days ago, or X a few days ago. The first thing when any of my colleagues have been hit or I've been hit is SLT, going to that staff member and asking, are you okay? That is the priority, how the staff member is doing. Violence is never okay, but the question is, do we want violent children in this context to become violent adults? And I think the answer is no. I think everybody would say the same. And it's about what can we do to prevent that? And passing that buck of the problem on and on and on is not going to solve that. Now, I agree with Andrew. There is no off-the-shelf strategy that we can roll out nationwide that will fix behaviour. The raw numbers of exclusions, PXs are so low, even smaller still when we're talking about violence. And when we're looking in schools at best bets for how to improve, say, Progress 8 scores, we're looking at things that are across a whole suite of, thousands, millions of students. We don't have that luxury. What we do need to do is work on a one-to-one basis and go, okay, this student has this problem. What can we do to fix it? What needs do we have to address? Yep, there's often stuff in the home life. What additional services do we need to get involved? What can we do to help stop this child who's been violent from then growing up and that perpetuating? So I don't think trying to deal with that just within a mainstream setting when we're talking violence, and I think when we're hitting on those really extreme behaviours like extreme violence, sexual assaults, things like that, we are talking about a becoming vanishingly small number when we're looking at what is already a small number of permanent exclusions as raw numbers. And yeah, they need to be dealt with in a certain way. Some of them aren't right to be taught in a classroom with other students. When I worked in the Day 6 provision, that I worked with every single Key Stage 3 permanently excluded student in a local authority. That's what we did. Some of them weren't taught on site because that wasn't feasible to do. But you still have to work with students who show really horrific behaviours. In mainstream, what I don't want to happen too much is get too sidetracked on what is this very small raw number of real extreme behaviours, when there is a whole host of persistent disruptive behaviour, for example, is about, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you know them, about 38%, I think it was. Andrew, you'll know the number, I think, better, but
I can't remember it for this year because it's sort of changed in the last few years.
At 39% for 22-23.
So what's your view on that?
It's usually top of the list.
Yeah.
So David, I'll start with you, David. I might ask Andrew this as well. What is your view on that, David? That persistently disruptive behaviour line?
So I think it is that catch-all term. It's where you're trying to, or where you perceive you need to permanently exclude, and it's just through a build-up of things. I think where I have concerns is that I think often it can be done to permanently exclude a student where you've not necessarily followed the right procedures. And that's where you do see a lot of appeals, which are then upheld. And again, that I think is where the solicitors from the article are coming in, which is that much like a prosecution in the courts, if you are going to do something that does have an impact on future prospects for a young person, you have to dot every I, cross every T. It has to be correct. And I think that my concern is where it's the triggers pulled too quickly, to take your phrase from earlier.
What? But give me an example, though, David, of the trigger being pulled too quickly on persistently disruptive behaviour. Give me something, an anecdotal example.
An anecdotal example: 2 students were permanently excluded. They'd done some behaviour in the local community which was perceived as bringing the school into disrepute. It was, for one of the students, there was a bit of a pattern of behaviour. For the other, it was the first time. It was put down as persistent disruptive, and other things were brought into it. Now, obviously, we're only kind of hearing the one side in the AP. I'm not naive enough to think there isn't more to it. But we do see all the paperwork that comes with it. We see all of the confidential notes that the school has logged previously, behaviour records and so on. And, you know, we do see that. And that's an example of pulling trigger, making an example where actually could something more restorative have been done, where you look at that incident and I've got to be a little vague because obviously I don't want anyone to be identifiable or anything, but where actually when it's a one-off event, can we just look at what's gone on and how can we address that?
But surely that phrase persistently disruptive implies that it's not just a one-off event. Like, surely.
It certainly implies that, but I think that what you get is then you just bring in previous, say, class charts logs, which can bulk up your log of things as evidence. And it might be minor, but it can contribute to it. And I think that's what you sometimes see, and what you might sometimes see in appeals is where a whole string of previous things which weren't escalated at the time go on to a single event in order to tip it onto that persistent disruptive threshold.
Andrew?
Well, I've heard senior managers say that that's exactly what they do. But the reason they do it is because if they put in just the one incident, no matter how serious, and somebody kicks up a fuss about some procedural anomaly, or what about this teacher? We don't think much of them. Perhaps they could have dealt with it differently. And people will come up with excuses over one incident. Whereas if you put in all the incidents, they're more likely to accept that the school is doing it for a good reason. I don't want to defend schools that just put in persistent disruptive behaviour when that's not really the issue. But it is that situation of people trying to resist exclusions that are necessary that makes schools do it. and perhaps that category doesn't really need to be broken up, and it should just be we can include consideration of their past behaviour.
I mean, listen, David, let's be honest. I don't think a school would be moving towards thinking about exclusion on the lines of persistent disruptive behaviour. And again, I have to caveat this with this is anecdotal. This is anecdotal. This isn't based on some data I've got in front of me. This is just based on sort of, I guess, my viewings and experiences and things I've seen of schools. Is if they're looking to exclude a child, this is where I guess we're going to have different views, isn't it? There's going to be people who think that schools are sort of, I'm not saying there's anyone who thinks schools want to exclude, but there's plenty of people out there who think that schools will use any old excuse to exclude someone who is causing sort of any sort of issues for them, right? And my sort of, the counter to that is, and if you speak to a lot of teachers, they'd say this just simply isn't the case. If somebody is at that level of being considered for a long-term exclusion, a permanent exclusion, sort of for persistently disruptive behaviour, there has to be, grounds. Let's say that. But there is obviously this group of lawyers, for example, there are over 200 lawyers, and lots, I'm sure, of parents out there would disagree with what I've just said and would say, no, schools are too trigger happy with it. Schools are picking on particular students. Schools are ignoring SEND or ignoring this and this and this. I mean, what's your view, David, on this? Is the exclusion process in UK schools disproportionately targeting certain demographics, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or minority communities?
So I think targeting is the wrong word, because I don't think it is intent. I don't think there is intent there. I think that they disproportionately impact some demographics. I know that we've talked briefly about different ethnicities. I think the one that I'd raise is Gypsy, Roma and Irish Traveller, where their PX rate was 0.43 and 0.35 respectively, and versus the overall rate of 0.11. Now, adding the caveat, which because Andrew was talking about raw pupil populations then, so it's only 0.4% of the pupil population across England. But if you take a different cohort, the Chinese cohort is 0.8, but their PX percentage is way, way lower. So, and we're also not seeing any fluctuations really in the Gypsy, Roma and Irish Traveller exclusions over time. So it's hard to just argue it as anomalies being inflated by low numbers, because we're seeing that consistency over time. And I think that other research has shown that there is increased stereotyping by school staff, and I'm not saying intentionally, but it's happened that students from these communities are more violent. And there is also research showing that some of the things that they are punished for has been responses to things like bullying they've received based on their ethnicity. And then just again to underline it, there was a previous Children's Commissioner report granted from 2012, but it highlighted 100% of PX appeals made by those demographics were upheld. So the appeals were upheld for that group. Now, granted, those numbers will be low because they're low raw numbers. But, when appeals are upheld, something has been done incorrectly. Now, that might just be procedural, but sometimes it is that actually this didn't warrant that level of sanction. I think Andrew wanted to come in a little bit earlier on the numbers.
With the Irish Travellers, the numbers are, they really are tiny, and it does fluctuate a bit because of the small numbers, although it is consistently, one of the highest. But there's in Britain's, in England's 20,000 plus schools, there are, I think, 6,000 Irish Traveller pupils. So, when we talk about that, and it was had a really high rate of permanent exclusions, but that was 24 pupils. So it's one of those things where if you want to look into the problem, you could look into the individual schools. I'm always a bit cautious though with the traveller ones of blaming it on prejudice, not because I don't think they face prejudice, but partly because for two reasons that make me sceptical of that. The first is the Timpson report, which is a few years ago now, but it did take all the school data, include it, and analyze it and do regressions against exclusions, and it found that once you accounted for all the factors affecting travellers, and they counted both categories as one, when you take those into account, the risk of permanent exclusion for travellers was less than expected. So you could take ethnicity out of that picture and just basing on past academic performance, free school meals and things like that, you would actually predict an even higher rate of permanent exclusion.
I mean, that's fair, but again, that highlights how high the PX rate for free school meals are, for example. So again, it's where maybe arguing prejudice is perfectly reasonable, but there are certain groups, whatever those factors are, and as you say, some groups have really complex overlapping factors, but they still have those elevated risks that I don't think we adequately address in schools, and I think we could do more to work with the data and not necessarily just arbitrarily reduce PXs, but an understanding that actually are there other ways that we can deal with things more generally, and where are those where there might be solutions that don't require a PX that then just recycles that issue to another school.
I didn't get onto my second reason. The second reason I'm not so sure about whether prejudice can be the factor in this is because it's not. I mean, just from personal experience, teachers often do not know which of their pupils are travellers. I mean, you can sort of stereotype and think, oh, well, we'll pick up on the stereotypes, but that assumes that every teacher has a stereotype in their head and that every traveller child matches it. I've certainly been in a situation where I actually looked up on the system a child's ethnicity, and literally everyone knew the child, but no teachers knew off the top of their head that was their background. I think you're right. Looking at the other factors is more important. The trouble is that when you start looking at those other background factors, these tiny groups just get lost amongst the disadvantaged white British pupils who make up the vast bulk of permanent exclusions. It's often difficult to actually, identify, even where an ethnic group has a high exclusion rate, anything about that ethnic group that doesn't apply across the board to a huge subsection and communities amongst white British pupils. And
David, sorry, Andrew. David, I just wanted to follow up on this as well. Is you mentioned sort of pupil premium students, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So, and you're saying how you're talking generally about how to address that and make it less likely they're going to end up getting suspended, excluded, etc. How would you like to see students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds treated differently to those who are not?
So I think this can end up becoming a very tricky debate, in that I don't want to stereotype, and I think when we create stereotypes, it's really bad. I think, as discussed before, that idea of equity rather than equality and giving people what they need to succeed rather than just a blanket everybody gets the same thing is important. And I think some students who are free school meals or pupil premium have different indicators that
Oh, I think David's dropped. Andrew, has David dropped?
I can't hear him.
Yeah, I think he's dropped. He's frozen. He's literally gone. Oh, he's back. He's back. He's back. Try again, David. Try again.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I'm going to pull back slightly and talk slightly more generally about what I think you could do in terms of supporting students more broadly, and that idea of treating students differently, equity rather than the same, equality, in order to improve outcomes all round. I think simply saying free school meals, I think is concerning, because I think some students struggle with different things that will impact them. And I think what we're seeing, let's say, moving back to the what I'd classify as high control schools, which I'd say are ones which are behaviourist and introduce rules on things such as sock colours, hair lengths, things like that, which are a subset. That there are some students where they're not getting into the classroom because of they're not meeting that rule, and there can be various reasons for that. An isolation loop, but then what happens is they lose their connection with that school. They start to resent the school. They don't become part of the society. That can lead to spiraling behaviour, and that's when you get the persistent disruption and things. And I think that recognizing that there are certain things where we are making hoops we are creating hoops for students to jump through that are necessary for education.
You keep dropping, David, slightly. I don't know if it's your Wi-Fi or something. You just keep dropping slightly.
I'm so sorry.
No, don't worry. Don't worry. You're good.
And I think that when we create the hoops for students, rather than try and eliminate the barriers, and those barriers will be different for every student, but students from low socioeconomic backgrounds will have more barriers of entry for various points. I think we'll need more support. One school I saw on Twitter, who I don't agree with everything they've done, but gave out free uniform to every student, for example. And I think when we find ways to reduce barriers that are innovative, we can improve behaviour overall, and then reduce suspensions that way.
But you're implying, I mean, how many students who are excluded or permanently excluded based on uniform or equipment?
So I think that what you start to get is you produce that everything starts somewhere. When we're looking at behaviour, there are very few students who come straight into a school and immediately flip the tables and hit a teacher. It does happen, but those are those extreme behaviours. A lot of the time, it is the small things that then spiral. And when we see things on the news, such as parents lining up outside the school to complain about the uniform policy, or that it's too strict or draconian, we're creating a bit of a fracture between the community and the school. And rather than the school being the centre of the community, it's set in opposition to certain parts of it. Then you're reducing student respect in the school, and you're actually breeding that level of resentment that will then spiral onwards and upwards. And when we create these micro rules for students to have to follow, and if they don't, they are now the bad kid. That is the way that, you know, they can be painted. They're getting the negative comments for getting a pen, for having white socks instead of black, or instead of the right PE socks. Then you are choosing to create a student who is perceived as being bad, either through their own self-image or by peers. And then that is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
But coming back to my original question, though, how many have been excluded based on uniform or equipment?
To flip that back, how many would you say have been excluded where their first comment was uniform or equipment?
As in the first thing that ever happened that was
as in the first comment that they got at school was a uniform or equipment.
But that's sort of that's. I mean, you know, my first comment in school could be I tripped over a basket and fell over and knocked someone over and they got hurt by it, and it's just a one-off incident in year 7, and then 7 years later I assault someone and get excluded. So what? I don't see why that's relevant to that.
I'd argue it's relevant just because I think that the majority of the times that I've seen permanent exclusion, and that's with working with dozens of PX students, is how rare it is that it's a one-off incident and that you see this increase.
No, I understand. I get that. I mean, my question was more around because you mentioned, you know, this segment, if you like, started off with me asking you how you would see, because we talked about more students being excluded or in danger of exclusion from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, pupil premium, free school meals. I said to you, how would you like them to be treated differently? You then started to talk about uniform and equipment. Yeah. So my implication from that was that you would like a more lenient approach towards equipment and towards uniform and towards other things of that ilk that you feel are a barrier for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds as a solution or a possible solution to the danger of them being excluded.
I will. No, that's fair. What I'll do is kind of restate that point a little bit more succinctly, as I think a solution or a step for some of those students is to stop turning them into a naughty student early in their school career in year 7 through things that we don't need to criminalize, that we don't need to make an issue of, because then that feeds into their own self-image and that self-perpetuates. So it's not necessarily about the uniform and stuff. What it is about is that student sees their peers succeeding and not getting comments, and they are often getting them. And again, from their own perception, often unfairly, they don't understand it, why they deserve it, because maybe so anecdotal examples that I've experienced, they get a negative comment because they left a book at a parent's house, but they were staying at another parent's house because their parents are divorced. So they've come in, they didn't have all their equipment because some of it's at the other parent's house. So they get a negative comment. They view that as unfair, but they've been labelled as getting it wrong. Some schools, that's an immediate after-school detention for half an hour, and you're punishing them in their own head for having divorced parents. That then spirals us into worse behaviour, not for every student. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying, but that is a starting point for a lot of the problems. And if we stop that and we address that and we support those students in succeeding and seeing themselves as successful rather than as failing, then I think we have more opportunity down the line.
Andrew, do you want to come in on any of that?
It feels again like a solution in search of a problem. I just don't even see the connect. I might object to certain school rules, but the idea that exclusions will be affected by getting rid of them, I'd love to see the evidence for it. I mean, I started teaching in the noughties and I worked in schools where the uniform was a jumper. The rules were a lot more lenient. It did not improve behaviour. It did not stop more serious incidents. I'm sceptical when people say, you know, you deal with behaviour by sweating the small stuff. But lowering standards, you know, asking with every rule, well, can we let people push it? I don't think it improves things. I think you have to actually just take the rule on its merit. And certainly things like forgetting equipment, forgetting a pen, when that's tolerated, it doesn't become it may be a minor thing for that pupil, but it doesn't become a minor thing for the rest of the class. You know, you can habituate children into not bothering bringing equipment by saying it's no big deal. With rules on uniform, I think schools should be careful not to be arbitrary, but often from outside, a rule that seems arbitrary was actually a response to children taking the mickey. I mean, it's like, school introduces a rule that says you must have black socks, but that can be introduced after weeks of children with, polka dot socks looking ridiculous. So some of the haircut rules perhaps can be made more lenient, but some of those got introduced, decades before, when people were worried about skinheads. You have to take school. I don't mind people saying perhaps that school rule is out of date, perhaps that school rule is no longer appropriate. Let's have a sensible discussion about it. But picking individual rules, saying that's a high control school, and then claiming that will getting rid of that rule will have a huge positive effect, I don't agree with. There's always going to be rules that you need to enforce, and there's always going to be a problem if you just try and get rid of rules because you can't be bothered to enforce them, or you're hoping to avoid conflict. And having worked in schools that were very low control, I don't remember that as a time where serious incidents were rare. In fact, low control and lots of serious incidents are, in my mind, quite highly correlated.
David, I don't know whether you want to throw in on, but I was going to ask you, David, following on from that, what are the things, you've given one or two examples, granted, but what should be ignored then? I mean, it's easy to say, well, we need to sort of let a few things go here because it might lead to negative stuff and conflict and problems, and it helps to be more specific. Just to highlight that, we've had two different comments actually. One from Musin, who has said, sorry, that's the wrong one. One from Musin, who earlier said, the usual low standards expectations for pupils from less privileged backgrounds. We've also had a comment from Rachel that said the constant nitpicking, just to paint the two, I guess, opposites of that argument. But I did want to ask you, David, you've mentioned that for students specifically from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to let certain things pass, and you've mentioned it, sort of things around uniform and equipment and certain things around that, but where do you draw the line on that? And obviously there will be those who would say, well, that is the sort of soft bigotry of low expectations for people who need the highest expectations and all that sort of stuff.
So I think that's a fair point, and I think Andrew got it right, where I think there are some rules that can be arbitrary, and enforcing them arbitrarily is of no good to anybody. And I think that
I said rules that seem arbitrary.
I apologise. Sorry, I didn't mean to misrepresent you. So I think that there are rules that can seem arbitrary, and I think that I think is a challenge in itself. But I think that we also need to separate having low expectations from having different expectations. Just making sure that a student is wearing the perfect shoes, socks, uniform is not the same as having a high standard, and having a high standard for behaviour can be viewed so totally differently to others. What I'm saying is having artificial stoppers, barriers in the way of which are totally separate from academic standards and from behavioural standards doesn't suit, and it doesn't do anybody any good.
But when you say stoppers and barriers, what you're actually talking about is rules.
So no, it's rules which I think are arbitrary. So I use the examples of sock colour, hair length, which have been in the news. They have zero impact on a student's behaviour. They have zero impact on a student's education. Whereas if we ignore those rules, we can concentrate on, okay, how are we going to behave in the classroom, and how are we going to learn and make sure that we get it right. And I think you can have high standards, but what you don't need to do is, again, all the students who came through the PRU, there was a commonality of the low perception of themselves. Like, part of that is once a student has that label PX, it really does impact their self-perception, but also they've been built up, well, I'm a bad student, this is just what I do. That is their self-perception. And I think we can address that earlier and we can actually work with that. And so it's not about what rules we need to remove, but it's about, okay, how can we say we've got it wrong now, but what sanction is appropriate there? How can we make sure that it doesn't happen again? I think that is the biggest thing. How do we stop a behavior we don't want from happening again? And detentions don't really do that. Suspensions don't really do that. PXs have a limit to what they do. When you look at the reoccurrence rate, Andrew pointed out earlier that one of the biggest indicators of PX is a suspension. So it shows that suspension isn't changing the behavior in a lot of cases, Detentions, if that behavior is...
Suspensions are a lot more common than PXs, so
they certainly are.
Probably, it wouldn't. That's not evidence that they don't change the behaviour in the majority of cases.
What you do see, you do see the same students getting suspended repeatedly. That is common among student data within schools. So the fact that that student has been suspended, maybe they never get to a PX, but the fact that they've been suspended doesn't mean that they don't reoffend because they get suspended again. And again, in behaviourist schools, if detentions work...
So behaviourist schools?
Schools that take a behaviourist approach, the idea that... Okay. So that idea, I'll explain it. A behaviourist school would be one which uses principles of behaviorism. Behaviorism is that we can change behaviour through how we interact with it in terms of punishing it, a little bit more like almost Pavlovian responses. So the idea that we don't want this behaviour...
You mean enforcing rules? It's a school behaviourist if it enforces the rule. No. There's a consequence for breaking it.
No. There should always be a consequence for breaking a rule, but a behaviour...
When does it become behaviourist?
So behaviorism is the idea that to change behaviour, it can be done by an external force, i.e. a detention, a suspension will change the behaviour.
All approaches to behaviour involve external forces. You can't change a child's behaviour by staying away from them and doing literally nothing. I mean, everything you do is an external stimuli.
So there is a difference between doing something to and doing something with. So behaviour...
Exactly.
If I can finish, and let me explain it, then feel free to come back if it doesn't make sense to you. So behaviorism is about using external actions to change a behavior through habituating it. The typical example you'd use is the ringing the bell to generate the saliva response. In schools, when I'm referring to behaviorism and behaviorist schools, which is a fairly common phrase and it is used regularly on air.
It's used on air by people who are against discipline.
Let David finish his point, and then you can come in.
Then it's the idea that if you have a behaviour you don't want to see, like chewing gum, that you give a detention, that behaviour then stops. I think what we see is that actually often the same students get the same detentions for the same behaviour week after week. Not all the time. Some students get one detention and they're done. But there is a core of students that you would see, let's say in the main hall every Monday in a detention, and regularly it'll be for the same thing. So that approach doesn't work, but schools implement that frequently. I think the restorative approach that other schools go with is working with the student individually, and it can't work on massive cohorts. You can't do a big wider intervention. Is okay, why are we doing this behavior? Why are you repeatedly chewing gum? What is it? Is there something that we can unpick and change there? And that is the student internally changing that behavior, because instead of just saying you're going to change it because if you don't, you'll get this same detention over and over. It's, okay, what can we do so that you choose to change that behaviour, and then we move forward?
Andrew?
Well, I mean, it's such a false dichotomy that schools don't. I mean, every school, except for, pretty much every school enforces rules, and pretty much every school will try and intervene with its worst offenders. And yes, the detentions will fail with the worst offenders. That's what makes them the worst offenders. But also, so will all the other approaches. I mean, there's a behaviour intervention is good if it changes behaviour in even just a small percentage of pupils. There is no, oh, this school fails because its recidivists reoffend, and this school succeeds because no one ever reoffends. Because that, you know, most people who persistently break the rules keep breaking the rules. Where behaviourism comes into this, I mean, behaviourist theories can often explain the worst, you know, habitually bad behaviour, and tolerating the habitually bad behaviour will often just in its own way reinforce it, according to those theories. I mean, whenever someone tries to class following the enforcing rules as behaviourism, I usually object, and usually a behaviourist will pop up and say, but no, we're not in favour of enforcing the rules. We like these behaviourist ideas, not these ones. It's just not a helpful label for schools at all. And I don't see how you can distinguish enforcement of rules from behaviourism. And you can add something extra. You can say, oh, well, what about a restorative conversation? But the restorative conversation will probably have an even lower success rate than enforcing the rules on the worst behaved pupils, and schools do both anyway.
So I think again, it's a little bit of a mischaracterization of what I said. I think that enforcing the rules is important, and I think an enforced rule doesn't need to be a detention. That enforcement can be done in a wide range of ways. So I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is,
it presumably needs a sanction.
So sanctions can be wide ranging depending on what it is, and sometimes that might be the duration of a conversation that you are having with that student, reflecting on what they've done, is taking that time off them, say at a break, at a lunch, sometimes after school. And sometimes, yeah, you will do a detention, and that's fine, but it's finding the right fit for the right crime, making sure that you're meeting it. And I think behaviorism, I just Googled it to check I wasn't going insane. And if you look at behaviorism in schools, there are pretty solid definitions on there. It's not an entirely uncommon term, and it is about that idea that you are attempting to change behavior in that way. And I find it I've previously, prior to this conversation, found it a much less confrontational phrase than, say, zero tolerance, because I agree, no school is zero tolerance. But I do think that some schools put a greater weight on the sanction versus the prevention in terms of how much time they spend with the children who have broken a rule. Just leaving a child to just go sit in a detention after breaking a rule, as I say, some of them might never do it again, but there's a time investment that's needed, and it's a bespoke work that's needed with a student to change behavior. And that's why there isn't evidence on a wide scale of here's this one intervention from this book that changes behavior for all the, because every student has a different reason for behaving the way that they are. And sometimes that is just they are a teenager who wants to kick off because they are a teenager with hormones flying around and things like that. Absolutely. Sometimes it's because there is something that's happened at home that day that's really unsettled them, and they're bringing it into school. Just like sometimes I'll come home from work and be a bit grumpy, but I have more emotional regulation than a 13-year-old.
I mean, I don't I'm trying not to get hung up on terminology, but I really don't like the labelling of schools. And I've never encountered a school that would label themselves as behaviourist. It's always people outside objecting to rules that use the term.
I'm happy to remove the word behaviourist.
Actually, I will take that back. There are schools that would call themselves behaviourists. They would tend to be special schools and independent, and they would not recognise themselves as being about sanctions in that same way. And in particular, the idea that behaviourism is opposed to prevention, I don't think any actual behaviourists would agree. They'd say behaviourism was about prevention.
David, I wanted to ask you. Oh, sorry, Andrew, go on.
Well, and it's more generally, yeah, I mean, I keep pointing out that there's a lack of approaches that are evidence-based that work. But if it then comes down to, well, we just work with each individual kid until they change their behaviour, it's just, does that mean they actually do change their behaviour? I think there's a lot of wishful thinking in, the how do I reach these kids model, where if you just throw enough resources, enough sympathy, smile enough, give them a biscuit, then eventually they'll break down and tell you that they were traumatized. And
so I think that's such a straw man, and I think it's worth totally kind of addressing that now. In that tea and biscuits thing is clearly a nonsense, and no one who works in a trauma-informed school thinks that. There is no one I've met, and I've worked in some. So there is a huge difference between having just a wishy-washy view and then building on settled neuroscience and views on things like how the limbic system works, brain development, and on the ideas that brain plasticity in
sorry, David, I'm not laughing at what you're saying. I'm just laughing at Andrew's reaction to what you're saying.
Fine. But there is a lot of evidence for all of those things, which is published in peer-reviewed journals, in medical journals, and that we know has an impact and has an effect on child development. And in terms of your criticism of the person previously who messaged in talking about child development, well, I do work in a school, and yes, I am talking about child development. And we know it has an impact, and we know that actually there are certain good bets you can do with individual students who've had certain experiences. What I do with my own students at my on-site alternative provision, we see the behaviours, we witness them, we see what the triggers are, we see what helps avoid those triggers, we see how we can make sure that we can bypass those if they start getting dysregulated, what we can do to bring them down again. And then we have a really useful document bespoke for that child, which helps regulate them more. And it does change behaviours. Granted, we've never turned a student from one who is viewed as a highly dysregulated student showing very challenging behaviours into one who is perfect in the classroom, but we have taken students that first very challenging behaviors, given teachers strategies for working with and engaging that student, and made them be able to cope in a classroom and get an education through giving those strategies. And they are bespoke to each child because each child responds differently.
Andrew?
Well, I sort of reacted because the whole idea of finding triggers, isn't that behaviourism? That isn't that actual behaviourism if you're looking for cues and so on. I mean, beyond that, I mean, if you can in the environment of a PRU do that, good luck to you. Although I would love to see hard data rather than just take it for granted. I immediately become skeptical when people bring this neuroscience into it, because the correlations between brain activities and behaviour are not terribly helpful. And when people come up with a nice story with a couple of MRI pictures, it usually doesn't it usually doesn't help things terribly much. And I've noticed that although there are some traumatic experiences, that correlate to behaviour problems and also correlate to patterns that can be found on brain scans. It tends to be the case that the brain scan picture doesn't necessarily correlate to the behaviour. It's a very clever way of making things sound more scientific to start talking about bits of brain and the limbic system. But it is behaviour we're addressing, and trying to give it all a physiological cause or a medical cause. I wish it was possible that would work, but doctors can't do it. So why do we think teachers can cure medically habitual bad behaviours?
So it's not about curing it. It's about striving to understand something better. So taking a purely educational example, we know that students that hear more words in the home are going to academically do better. And that is related to the same things that we see in terms of the brain development and that plasticity of the brain in terms of interactions that they're getting from the parents as well. And we see some of those same kinds of changes to brain structure that you get through that constant communication that we see in the inverse in other family backgrounds. And that, it's the same idea, that neuroscience that underpins it. It doesn't mean that we can suddenly, I agree with you, we can't point to an MRI scan and say that means that they're going to flip a table next lesson. That's a nonsense. And again, no one I know who talks about the neuroscience in terms of the training that I've had, in terms of the research that I've done in masters and things like that, none of that is about pointing to an MRI. It's about understanding that the development that children have affects how they might act overall, and what we can do to try and understand that, make accommodations for it and make improvements to it, even though, no, we can't fix it, we can't cure it, but we can work more smartly.
The trouble with biological explanations of human behaviour is that you end up in genetics. The genetic influence on behaviour is stronger than any environmental influence. Now, that just makes me want to steer clear of it. I do not want to say if a child is badly behaved, then there's something up with their genes, or, we have to stop people having that combination of genes, or we must sterilise their parents or whatever. But I think that's where biology goes. I think when you start claiming the, personality traits, behaviours can be traced to
I'm sorry, I do have to put in there, I'm really sorry, just because, I mean, you could use that argument for, say, PE in school, like the bottom line on physical achievements, genetics plays a massive role in how well you're going to do in a sport, but it doesn't mean that we don't work with the technique and get the practice right and do the exercise. Like, there's a whole section of biology we can work with whilst going, we can't change genetics, but we can work on this bit, and we do it in PE. There's no reason why we can't do it in terms of behaviour.
If genes were destiny, I think we'd all be out of a job. It's just once you start trying to find biological sources for issues, it's hard. It's hard. You end up just getting caught out by where the biological correlations are. And the books thing is a good example. A number of psychologists have suggested that it isn't the amount of books you're growing up with that affects your later reading ability. They've suggested that there is a common genetics involved, that parents who are naturally prone to reading produce children that are naturally prone to reading. As I say, it's just a direction. I don't think we should be trying to solve education problems with genetics, but I think the moment we start claiming that we have a biological cause of behaviour that we have to work with, we're going to soon find out that it isn't all about trauma. It isn't about interventions in the first 5 years. It isn't about child development, it's literally, you know, far less impressive and far more sinister sounding.
I think that what we can do, though, everything is intersectional in that, you know, even going back to the conversation earlier about the makeup of different cohorts of students who are permanently excluded, but like the complex reasons for behavior, we can't like fully pull apart, but what we can do is look at it to the best of our abilities. And, you know, the PE example that I made, you know, even in PE lessons, talking about the right movement to have your arm in, the right angle to run in, where your knees are. That's something that, you know, children do in GCSE PE. And we don't go anywhere near genetics, and we're not looking for a biological explanation for behavior. We're looking at biological contributors. We're looking at potential trauma contributors. We're looking at potential anything that we can do, and then try and address those things. And, you know, there are some things that we can work on with students based on the knowledge we can build up about those very, very practical, real scientific things, without, I agree, touching on genetics and the kind of worms that is. But I mean, I guess you could argue the same about academics. At the core, at the very end of, you know, when we're doing our pedagogy, behind it is genetics. Do we just give up and not teach because actually it's genetics at the end of the day? And if we start thinking about, you know, the science behind teaching students to read and the science behind it, then eventually we might get onto, oh, well, actually it's all about genetics. That's a bit of a...
Well, that's what I'm trying to avoid, but I think that's the route you go down when you start trying to look for biological causes of behavior. I think you know, if you're going to say it's in your cells, it's in your... you end up, that's where you end up.
Andrew, I just want to pitch a comment that's come in from Yasmin Omar, one of our fellow TTR hosts. She says pupils from low socioeconomic backgrounds need and deserve the same standards as everyone else. But I still think I understand what David is saying. Am I right to say David is saying, and David, you can answer this, am I right to say David is saying that it's not the school rules that's the problem, it's the lack of context applied that would help students to feel included in their school community and have psychological safety?
I think that's put it much better, and maybe I should swap spaces with her so she can present my points better than I am.
I'll continue with what else she said. She said, as a lack of it can contribute to exclusion, because exclusion is more than just a suspension or a PEX. I agree with David that lots of small issues can be preempted, as it can likely escalate to bigger problems. And this is to you, Andrew. Surely it's fair to ask what schools do to prevent them and not just react.
I mean, I think the key thing for me is it would be nice to think that teachers could just be told, make kids more welcome, foster a sense of belonging, that will solve these problems. But if you don't get behaviour right, if you don't enforce your rules, it tends to create an environment that isn't terribly belonging. I mean, having worked in schools with decent discipline and schools with terrible discipline, sorry, let me rephrase that. So having worked in schools where rules are consistently enforced and ones where they're not consistently enforced, the ones where they weren't consistently weren't noticeable for being more welcoming and better loved and having better attendance. It's a tendency to just, you know, think that teachers are lacking in good intentions, whereas it's often a practical issue making children welcome in a school. And I would always put at the top of that list, keeping them safe, protecting them from each other, making expectations clear, setting boundaries. I think all those things are part of caring. And yet those are the things that will be given up on if we start saying, well, we don't want to enforce rules, we don't want to hassle them about doing this or that. It's not an either or. I think well, I don't want to say high expectations, it's almost a cliche, but clear rules enforced consistently I think, have a positive effect on the climate of a school, more so than teachers who have been told to care more.
David, I wanted to ask you, within the PRU, the AP that I know it's inside the school, if you like, or part of the school infrastructure, right? Do you have the same rules as they do in the school in your inclusion unit? So, for example, you said about uniform. So let's take that as an example, and uniform and equipment. Do you have the same rules in there as they do in the school?
We have the same rules. I think that's important as part of the making sure that they feel part of the community, which I think it was Yasmin pointed out is so important. And I think what we do is we ensure that we kind of scaffold things to meet it. So sometimes they will turn up completely in non-uniform. We then give them the uniform to get changed into. We don't go into lessons. We don't start the day in a structured way until they are in the uniform. But we're not going to punish them for not bringing their uniform. We're not going to sanction based on that, because we want them in the classroom learning. If they refuse to change into it, we have the facility to work with them kind of one-to-one in a separate area, but it's not isolation. It is working it constructively. And again, that's funded from trying to reduce the number of permanent exclusions and funnel that money across. So we have those same expectations and those same standards they need to meet, but
there aren't any sanctions for things.
We do sanction. We've suspended from the school before. I've done some after school, for want of a better expression, we've done an after school detention for students before, but it's making sure it is fit for that student with the aim of, it's always the question first when deciding what sanction to do is, how can we try and stop this behavior happening again, and what will be the most effective thing? So some of the students in my unit are doing the behaviors because they want to be suspended to go home and play on the game. So doing a suspension for those, for levels of behavior which on main site might result in a suspension, actually that's counterintuitive, because they want that and we are rewarding that behavior and we're teaching them that's a good idea. So doing something different, like, for example, giving them a detention so they stay longer, works better in that case. There are other students who where a suspension is the right sanction to do at that time, because that's not what they're trying to achieve from their behavior. So working closely and working in that tighter unit where you can get to know the students much better because you're working with them more intensely gives you that ability to respond much better.
Yeah, I mean, we're running out of time because we've done so much, we've covered so much. Maybe just we're going to put a max now of 5 more minutes just to cover the final little points, because I don't know how long you guys have got, but we could literally go on all evening in this conversation if we didn't put any limitation on it. So I wanted to ask though, David, sorry, I'm all about the practicality, because I do think the practicality is important. I think it's important to get into stuff that actually happens rather than talking in a general sense about, oh, and this and this. So, for example, if students swear at staff swears at a member of staff, I don't mean just swears, blooming heck. I mean actual aggressive swearing at a member of staff. You know, are you saying that there isn't a blanket thing for that you'd apply? You wouldn't suspend on that. You'd look at what the situation was with that.
So for me, with the students who swear directly at staff, that often happens in 2 occasions. One, because they are being they're choosing to be naughty. They are making a chosen behaviour, and then sometimes they've gone into a full meltdown. They are not really in control of what they're doing. They are yelling and screaming, and they've just lost it. And I think the way we deal with both of those situations differs slightly. And of course, sometimes my professional judgment might be wrong. I might misjudge one way or the other. If they are choosing to swear, they are addressed, they are picked up in the moment, they are redirected. That's not acceptable. We're not doing that. Now let's get back on with the lesson. Because again...
So there isn't a sanction, to be clear on there?
I think not necessarily in the moment. If it is persistent and continuing, we might look at things. So, for example, I've had a student who literally for maybe an hour straight was just being abusive continually towards me. And we did suspend for that because the level of it was so much. The odd, oh, F off, because I'm making them work. And normally this student would be internally truanting. They've not attended lessons for consistently for 3 years. They might turn up to one lesson, but then walk out halfway through, or they've just refused to come to school. Then actually my priority there is, no, we don't talk like that. Get on with the work. And we get through the lesson and we look at it. And over time, we see a reduction in that. The students where they completely have had, for want of a better expression, well, if they've got totally dysregulated and in that moment, they're abusive for maybe 10, 15 seconds, the priority then is get them calm and settled and regulated. We talk about the language used, but there isn't necessarily a sanction depending on what else they've done while they're dysregulated. But I will go away and work with the other professionals in the unit and go, okay, what do we think caused that dysregulation? How can we avoid it in future? What can we learn from that about how we can help them when they... so one of them... again, I'm trying to think of anonymity, so I'm sorry about that. One of them received a very specific insult from another student, one which referenced a personal trauma that they had had. They totally flipped out. They were swearing at me because I was getting in between them and the other student. So it's how can we work with that student where that extreme vulnerability doesn't produce that result? And again, that is a whole long bit of process. We've got external counsellors in to be able to help with it. We've got several external services, but our focus is get them that education. And we do have that luxury in a small setting to do it, but that's different from just being a naughty teenager. It's not acceptable and we're not accepting it, but they don't have that control yet. And we need to help them get there rather than just say, well, you're gone, we're abandoning you.
I understand, but I think there's a lot to unpick there because fundamentally, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that in many circumstances, if a student swears at a member of staff, there wouldn't be what we would call or term a sanction. There might be a conversation about their behavior. There might be some sort of intervention, I suppose, but fundamentally, there isn't a action coming off the back of that. I mean, you said yourself, you'll have a chat and then you'll get back to work if they swear at a member of staff. Now, my point would be that, my question is, are we preparing them for life after school by doing that? Because if they walk out of that AP or if they walk out of that PRU onto the road and they swear at a random person and they get their head kicked in, because they've done that, because they think that's okay. Are we making them think that's okay? Now, I understand that they have already gone through a mainstream school process to get to an AP and a PR. I totally get all that. But at the end of the day, out there, they're not going to distinguish between that. They're not going to care about what process somebody has been through in a school environment when they come up to assault someone or verbally abuse someone in the street. There is street rules out there, which every single person, and of course there is law enforcement rules. Never mind what might happen to them if they did it on the street, but you've then got the legal ramifications of that coming off the back. So I guess my wider question is, we talk a lot about what happens in there, But how do you think that impacts what happens out there?
So I think we'd be naive to think if they've gone through that process within the mainstream school, which I'm glad you pointed out, and they're showing these behaviours, they're already showing it on the streets outside of school. If we're realistic, they're already having run-ins. What my priority is how do we stop that behaviour? Because, again, they've gone through that mainstream process. A detention hasn't worked. A suspension hasn't worked. To get to the point where they're in my unit, they must be at risk of permanent exclusion. It's like permanent exclusion or into the unit that I run. So once you're at that point, things haven't changed their behaviour. So we have to look at something different. And we want two things. One, give them options so their education is more important in that moment, because if we can give them something. So we've got students who previously had no aspirations, wanting to go to college to do specific things, and have the aspirations now because we've done different things within the setting that have unlocked that for them. And then we do work with them on the behaviour and why we don't do it. But rather than just saying, right, it's a detention, that hasn't worked before, but we go, right, we can't say that because it has an impact. How would you feel if person X said this to your sibling? That's been successful and made them think a bit. It's not fully changed the behaviour, but what we do is we see that slow decline in those repeated behaviours because we've got the luxury of working for it longer. So we never say that's okay. We always pick up on it. I sometimes get flagged because it's often frequent in an AP. I sometimes miss it because you become weirdly immune to it, which isn't good because it does need calling out every time. But I've got colleagues who pick it up when I miss it. I pick it up when they miss it. Absolutely. Every time you challenge, you say that's not okay, but you move on and you address it later if you're in the middle of something, because sometimes they're doing it because the work's too hard and they want to avoid it. Not always, but that is a reason they do it. Then they get out of doing the work they don't want to do. Just redirect, say, that's not okay. Let's get back to algebra. Actually, algebra is easier than you thought it was. They complete the lesson. There's a sense of achievement. You pick up on stuff later. Those are things that do happen in the classroom. And that's not...
Well, I understand. I get it. I think my wider point was around this, and you said it yourself, that sometimes it is getting missed, or not missed, but it's not getting... You use the term picked up on when they are verbally abusive or stuff. And that this is where I think it's an intro, because we've gone from year 7 all the way through to when they, in your words, come in and aren't wearing the correct equipment and somebody gives them a negative point, all the way through to ending up in your AP where they're verbally abusive to staff, but still the message is the same one to the year 7, which is, well, we're not going to sanction you for this because of X, Y, Z. And I'm saying, when does that stop? When does it stop? Because it does stop out there still, just about.
No,
because as I said,
on the main site, if they swear to a teacher, they are given a detention. They are given a sanction. That happens. It's when they get to me, we can say, well, that hasn't changed the behavior. Like, I firmly believe the whole purpose of any sanction we should do is to change behavior, because we want to see them succeed and not show those behaviors.
But is their behavior not changing as a result of a sanction evidence that the sanction isn't working?
I would say yes. If you are doing the same sanction,
so therefore, then, David, you then must believe, then, correct me if I'm wrong, that if I'll pick my favourite team, Everton, if Duncan Ferguson headbutts someone, which he did regularly, actually, God bless his soul, and let's say he headbutts somebody, gets sent off, in the next game, he does the same thing. Are you saying he shouldn't get sent off? He shouldn't get a yellow card or a red card for that?
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that...
Well, that is what you're saying. You're saying that hasn't worked because he's done the same thing again. But this time, because it apparently hasn't worked, because he's done the same thing again, he's headbutted a player on the pitch, and he did that a lot. We're now saying, because we've given him a red card once or twice, we're not going to do it again because it hasn't worked. I'm just questioning that.
So I think we're moving into a different setting. I think again, because we're an alternative provision, we can do things differently to address that, because it clearly isn't working. He'll keep going out and headbutting people. You need to do something different to stop that happening. All you're doing is treating the behaviour, and he'll go on to a different club.
But maybe he needs to do something different.
Yes, maybe absolutely.
Maybe he needs to do something different. Maybe it's nothing to do with.
And
maybe
that was my earlier
just taking some responsibility and actually going, I need to stop doing this. It isn't the fault of the red card, because that's a sanction. That is a sanction that has always existed in the football league.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, which is what I was talking about earlier. And granted, Andrew didn't like behaviorism, but that core idea that actually change has to come internally. It's just, these are children, and often, they don't understand what's going on internally. And our job, especially in AP, is to go in and help them make that change themselves. Because their behavior won't change unless they do it themselves.
Is there a danger with normalizing verbal abuse? In the context of this conversation, someone might watch this and say, David is normalizing on certain levels direct verbal abuse towards staff.
I can see the argument. I don't believe that is what is happening, because we do challenge it, and that's why I don't think you should work.
Fair enough. I'm not saying that is the case, because I don't work with you. So let's not personalize it anyway. Let's just talk about. Imagine this is a whole bunch of sort of alternative provisions that we're talking about. And I do genuinely think this is an issue. I do think what we're talking about is important. Hence why 3,000 people have so far watched it on X. Not even on X, actually. 3,000 across everywhere so far have watched this. Because I do think this is an issue that we need to discuss more. And I really appreciate you two guys doing that. But also, we do need to get sort of, like I said, I keep coming back to this. Let's use that analogy then again. What is your suggestion then, David, with Duncan Ferguson? Let's use that analogy. He keeps getting sent off for headbutting people. Your argument is the sanction isn't working. So are you going to instruct referees to not give him any more yellow or red cards for headbutting?
No, but taking the analogy of alternative provision working within the school, you remove him from playing the game and you work with him in a much smaller setting, maybe on a five-a-side pitch, but you work with him and you do a intense amount of work around what he's doing. And you're saying, well, actually, if you want to be back playing for Everton, we're not going to force you to transfer to a different club. We're not going to kick you out of Everton, but we need to do this work with you. And once you've done this work, then we might be able to go back to playing for Everton on the big pitch again.
But can that work involve him headbutting people on the five-a-side pitch?
No, but I think you have to appreciate that behaviour isn't going to change by just showing him a red card every time he does it. You've got to do something different.
How do you know? How do you know?
How do you know that the red card?
Eventually, he did stop doing it because he got a 6-month ban. He got 3-match bans. Eventually, he did do less headbutting and less punching and less.
But that's because he's been given something different. And well, if he's got a 6-month ban, he's not playing for 6 months. That's something different. And I bet you anything, he'd have had conversations with backroom staff within those 6 months. They won't have been sat there going, no, we're not going to talk to you for 6 months. Come back after your holiday. They'll have been
all I'm saying is we haven't got evidence either way to say that it's not sanctions making a difference for Duncan Ferguson. You cannot categorically say that him getting sanctions for getting sent off for headbutting people didn't make any difference to his subsequent behaviour because he did it again.
Okay. I think at the risk of stretching kind of the metaphor is that
I love this Duncan Ferguson. I can see Andrew is loving this.
It's once you've seen the same behaviour repeated and the same sanction isn't making a difference, you've got to try something different. In the case of the football, it took what you're saying, a 6-month ban or whatever it was to make a difference.
Well, no, it didn't. He got banned for 6 months in Scotland at the start of his career. That was at the very, very beginning. He got banned for 6 months. He then, that was criminal charges on that one. Then he got signed for Everton. Then he carried on butting people. Yeah. There's an amazing picture of him strangling Stefan Freud like this. This is after that ban, right? Yeah. Big dunk, right? As I said, God bless his soul, Everton legend. But besides the point, he just kept doing it, right? And my point, I think it's an important. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on this?
I still haven't really got past the dysregulated part of this. When you were saying that when they get out in the real world, if they hit someone, they're going to be, held responsible. I was thinking, well, actually, even for adults, there's a defense of diminished responsibility. We don't tend to see that as letting them off because the consequences are being found to be, basically insane, and therefore not guilty, are often worse than being found guilty and, having the opportunity to, make amends and accept your punishment. And then you sort of trace that back. The word dysregulated covers kind of a lot of things, really. Dysregulated can mean they're literally not responsible for their behaviour, that there is no way they could control themselves. And dysregulated can mean, they're just not concentrating and they're not completely compliant. You sort of brought it up when Tom was asking you about a child that was, completely out of control and swearing at you, having been triggered over something in their background. I sort of found myself thinking, well, maybe they don't deserve to be punished if they're completely out of control, but they're more of a danger than ever. It's more serious than ever if they're not responsible for their actions. You have to start with people being responsible for their actions because that in itself is treating them as a human being, and it has to be the exception that they're not responsible.
I totally agree with basically all of that. I think I use dysregulated as a catch-all because I find that like bad behavior has different connotations, and I prefer to use dysregulated as a catch-all exactly as you just thing from not concentrating right the way through. But I think it is way worse when a student is not responsible for their actions. And I think that's something that we do see in alternative provision. We see students who, in certain moments, are totally out of control and potentially dangerous. And that's a really big part of what we need to do, is making sure that they get the help that they need, be it from us as teachers, but often way beyond us, to make sure that they are in control. And I think, again, you're right that when they're out of control, sanctioning them for that doesn't have any impact. So it's how do we work with them? And what we want to do is reduce that time when they are out of control through things that we're in control of, changing the situation, changing the environment, changing the support that they get, however we can do it. But make sure that we get the right external agencies and the right referrals in to actually stop that happening in future.
But as an answer to a question about would you put up with a child doing this, it does. In a way, he has to put up with it if it cannot be stopped. But it sort of changes the whole nature of the relationship with the child and their behaviour. And I suppose that sort of comes out with, if a child does not respond to any sanctions, it could be that situation that they completely lack self-control and will never take responsibility for their actions. Sorry, I'm sort of raising a dilemma rather than making a point, but it was just.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think there's an answer necessarily to that. One interesting comment came up in the comments around. So Christian, who works in Spain, has said, "I'm not sure in the UK. Here in Spain, we lack staff to attend such demand." Now, I did want to ask, and you guys might know this better than I do, but I've obviously worked in 2 European countries now, and is this whole sort of conversation around exclusions, send, alternative provisions, PRUs, and if you like, the sort of things we're discussing here in terms of the investment, if you like, into that, not just the investment, but the one of the other comments on here from Linda was around, well, what about all the other students? We've spent the best part of nearly 2 hours here talking about the students who are in danger of exclusion or getting excluded, because that becomes, if you like, the nature of so many of the conversations we have. And my question is that a Britain US thing? Is it that in Asia or in in parts of Africa or in India or in parts of Europe even, have we become? Is this a sort of an us thing? What's going on, or is it a global thing? We're noticing stuff more, right? And we're investing more into it. Or the flip side of this, are we just not simplifying it enough and going, and obviously, people wouldn't like this, but, you've done this, you're out. Or, you've done this, here's the consequence, move on. In other nations, maybe it is more like that. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying, where do you two sit on that?
I mean, I find international comparisons extremely difficult on relationship when it comes to.
I mean, I'm just doing broad stuff. Yeah,
it's one thing. I was going to say England, but I think it's the United Kingdom as a whole led the way on is recording permanent exclusions and suspensions and monitoring them and publishing figures and doing things like that. And often, I find people will claim, well, over in this country, there are no permanent exclusions. And you look into it, and yes, there is no record of permanent exclusions, but maybe a teacher that works there pops up and said, yeah, we do lose some students completely, or we do send them away for the rest of the year and they have to repeat the year, or some other alternative that we wouldn't consider to be, civilized and inclusive. It would be a sanction, and quite a serious one, but perhaps not recorded and registered in the way we do. So I'm sort of got more of an idea of the differences between the different parts of the United Kingdom than I have other countries. And often there's just nothing being recorded, but teachers can tell you something is done.
Yeah. I'm gonna end with one last question to both of you, which I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about, which is, what is the one thing you would like to happen to reduce exclusions? Okay. What's the thing? What's the number one thing, if you like, that you would want to happen more or less of to reduce exclusions? Okay, that's going to be my question in a minute. Before I do that, we've had a comment from Mohammed. Mohammed, welcome. I'm new to Teachers Talk Radio. I'm going to be starting my teacher training next year. Is there anything you can recommend in terms of books or videos? I have autism. I'm very nervous. I'm also doing a PGCE. Well, listen, Mohammed, good luck. And thank you very much for getting in touch. And all the best for the PGCE. Please try not to be too nervous. It's very early days for you. So, and everyone's in the same boat. I don't care what anyone says. Every teacher is no teacher starts sort of a school year without a little bit of nervousness and a little bit of apprehension. So don't feel like you're alone because you're doing a PGCE. So yeah, absolutely reach out to us, Mohammed. You can visit the website, ttradio.org. We've got tons of stuff on there, but actually the wider world of social media is out there too. So to get yourself onto, if you can tolerate it, get yourself onto X, start following people like David and Andrew and lots of the other people on there who can maybe help you out and give you, blogs and books and videos or links to things. There's so many different outlets and things out there for you to access. Miles has said, I'm not sure what Miles is asking there. Any info on the TDA? Not sure what you mean, Miles. You'll have to message again. Don't know. Anyway, final thanks to John Catt, who have sponsored this show. It's been wonderful. Thank you to them. You can visit them at johncattbookshop.com. You can use the code JCTTR2425 to get 20% off any book. We really appreciate you, John Catt. So, Andrew, I'm going to start with you for our final question of the evening. If there was one thing that you would want to happen more or less, or want people to start doing, or something to reduce exclusions, what would it be?
Do you want something more than better behaviour?
I was expecting you to say that. That's what I was expecting you to say.
I mean, yeah, that's the condition, as I say. If behaviour is not better, I don't want exclusions to reduce. I mean, in terms of is there something policy related or practical? I would love to see proper evaluations of behaviour interventions. I mean, the research on that is very limited, and I think I do think the worst behaved pupils need support. My worry is that the support does no good at all. And we don't seem to be, gathering the evidence of what would do good, what support would work and what wouldn't.
Thank you. And David, to finish off?
I think I'd say probably unsurprisingly, I think more on-site alternative provisions in schools. I think what we'll see with continued budget cuts in local authorities, that cycle from a permanent exclusion back onto fair access and into a new school without any intensive work being done is just going to accelerate. I think so. We'll see students with challenging behaviours come into schools and be on a cycle. Whereas if we've got units where you can hold students within your own school community, try and do the work there to try and mitigate things, to try and do that intense work and get them back into the school community, is preferable to just swapping one permanent exclusion from an entirely different school and potentially cultural community on the next fair access panel.
Guys, it's been thorough. I mean, we could have gone on forever. So thank you so much for being with us. Really, really appreciate it. I'll be back next Monday evening. Until then, thank you, by the way, to everyone who has tuned in, everyone who's commented, everybody who's got involved. And there's loads more that I haven't even seen on social media, but I've just read out some of the ones that have come in. So thank you very much indeed. This will be available, obviously, as a podcast. So if you've missed some of this, it's available to watch back as the whole video, but also we'll publish it as a podcast too. And I'll be back in a week on Monday evening. So thank you very much, everybody. And we will see you soon.
Outstanding and world-class vision, world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.